Before we begin, let's walk through our webinar platform together. Each of the buttons at the bottom of your screen relate to sections in the ON24 console. The speaker view is where you will see our presenters throughout the webinar. The slide view is where you'll see the accompanying slides. Our poll questions will also appear in the slide area. Be sure to click directly on the slide to answer poll questions throughout the webinar. You can resize these widgets for a larger or smaller view. You may follow along also with a PDF version of the slides that can be found in the related content widget. The CPE criteria section details the requirements you must meet to receive full credit for CPE in this session. To obtain CPE, you must do two things. First, be on the live webinar for at least 50 minutes, and second, respond to 3 of the 4 polling questions that will appear throughout the presentation. You can track your viewing progress in the Earn CPE widget on your screen throughout the webinar. By registering for today's event, you will automatically receive an email after 24 hours with a link to download the slides and a link to view the recording. Additionally, if you meet all the criteria and qualify for CPE, a link to your CPE certificate will be in that email as well. Please remember that it does take 24 hours for that email to be automatically generated, so look for it sometime tomorrow afternoon. For CPE-related questions, please reach out to cpe@yptc.com. In the related content section, you can access any accompanying materials for this webinar. This includes a PDF copy of the slides and many times will often include related resources. Reactions from our audience throughout the webinar will float along the console screen. Use the Q&A section to ask questions directly to our speakers throughout the presentation. In the speaker bio section, you can find more about our presenters, including their contact information. If you need technical assistance, please use the help button below. Many times, technical issues can be resolved by opening the webinar in Google Chrome or refreshing your browser. Finally, the evaluation button contains our post-webinar evaluation survey. Here is where you can share your commentary and feedback on the presentation. We hope you enjoy our free webinar. Now, let's get into today's topic. Hello and welcome all to Scenario Planning for Nonprofits. We are just so grateful to have over 450 of you guys with us today. And this is going to be a very valuable and relevant session. So I'm very excited to be here with you too. My name is Carly McIntyre. I'll be moderating today's session. And before we get into today's session, I would love to introduce who we and YPTC is. YPTC, or Your Part-Time Controller, is a professional services firm that specializes in nonprofit financial management with over 30 years of nonprofit expertise. Our services include accounting, reporting, data visualization, and best practices, just to name a few. And our network of almost 800 staff nationwide have seen it all, helping close to 2,000 clients throughout the United States, as well as clients in several other countries. So our session today is the second part of our Managing Through Uncertainty series. This slide here is just a copy of our course information, and know that our slides are available for download in the related content widget. So if you want to reference this or any of the other slides, please feel free to download those there. In this session, we will be exploring practical scenario planning and revenue diversification strategies that support financial sustainability, focusing on those strategies for building scenario plans, solutions for revenue diversification that really support that financial sustainability, and finally, reviewing best practices and questions to ask during the scenario planning process. So with that, and before I introduce our esteemed presenter, we would love to know who is joining us today. So this is the first of 4 polling questions. It will appear directly on the slide area. So go ahead and click on the slide and then press submit to respond to that poll question. So are you an ED, a board member, finance team member, development team member, or maybe other? And if you are other, if your title is not listed there, feel free to drop that in the Q&A, and we love to hear who you are and where you're coming from. So Bill, who we'll hear just a little bit more about in a second, I would love to hear from you. What are you hoping our audience today walks away with?
Well, sure. Thanks, Carly. And today is going to be a high-level overview of scenario planning and how you can obviously utilize that in your organization. We only have an hour, so trying to get in all the specifics on your particular situation would be tough, but it's a presentation that will lay the foundation for what we believe will be beneficial to you and your organization.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and know that there are 3 more polls left. So if you're not seeing that poll, go ahead and refresh your browser. And great to see everyone, grants managers, office managers, CFOs. And with that, I'll pass it over to Bill for an introduction and to get into the content.
Wonderful. Thanks, Carly. So, as Carly said, my name is Bill Mancuso, and I am a sales manager within YPTC, located on the West Coast. I'm contacting you from the beautiful state of Oregon today. And I've been a CPA for over 35 years, and I've been with YPTC about 3.5 years. My experience has been in public accounting, for-profits, nonprofits. I've worked in real estate, in construction, home building, education. So lots of different areas. And I tell you that because some of my experiences over my 35-year career are going to come into play as we talk about scenario planning today. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. First question is, what is scenario planning? And the reality is, scenario planning is a strategic planning method to create a variety of forecasts or outcomes. Really what this means is we're going to identify risks and opportunities, because it's not always negative, and create a lot of what if scenarios to be able to be proactive instead of reactive to things that might be going on. It provides a way for management to anticipate those challenges. And so anytime you do something, you don't want to be surprised. You want to have a plan in place and be able to be proactive if things come up. So in this scenario, that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, there are different ways that you can plan for the future. Many of us know the first one, which is budgeting. Budgeting, we all have budgets within our nonprofit organization. And the reality is that is a short-term plan, usually 1 year in length. And it allows us to look at the resources that we have and allocate those resources and kind of have a game plan, if you will, for the upcoming year. And it's pretty straightforward in terms of pretty much what's going to happen and what you're working with. The second one is a forecast. The forecast is a little bit different. It's a single scenario as well, but you're taking historical data for, let's say, the last 3 to 5 years, and along with your budget, you're able to identify with certain predictability what might be happening in the next year or 2 years, for example. And it does not allow for the what ifs. And that's what scenario planning does. And that's what we're going to focus our time on today. Scenario planning is more multiple scenarios in the what ifs, as I mentioned earlier. It gives us the ability to think about what things might happen and what plans do we have to have in place to identify risks and opportunities and be able to pivot if we need to be able to identify opportunities for our nonprofit organization. And it allows you to just think out of the box, because in the last few years we've encountered so many different things that people didn't know about. And so in our scenario, if you had that crystal ball and you were able to say with 100% certainty what was going to happen, then you probably wouldn't need to be on this conversation today. Matter of fact, if you knew exactly what was going to happen down the road, then my suggestion to you is, after this presentation, let's go hop a plane to Vegas, because all our problems would be solved. But the reality is we don't know. And so that's why we create scenario plans. Now, many of us might be in what we would consider a crisis mode right now because of all the circumstances that are going on in the environment. And so our focus is very short term. So we look at, in a crisis mode, maybe something within the next 3 months to 12 months. And the reality is it's very short term and it's focused on the current situation. I happen to have been in the home building industry in Las Vegas in the late 2000s. And you can imagine, if you remember what life was like back then, that was crisis mode for us. And so we had to come up with various different scenarios on a very small scale and short time frame. But even if you're not in crisis mode and you're in regular planning and you're thinking about things in the next 3 to 5 years, you still want to do scenario planning because it gives you the ability to think a little bit longer. It could be 12 months to 3 to 5 years, and it gives you the ability to think about what might be coming up. When I was in the education industry, often I was asked, where are we going to be 5 years from now? Well, that's a very tough question in any organization, but particularly in the public education arena, because there are so many different factors. There's funding issues, there's negotiating with teachers unions and support staff unions that happen multiple times in a 5-year period. So like that example in your nonprofit, there's probably lots of things that are going on and potentially going on. Maybe you want to add new programs, maybe there's funding issues. And so it gives you the ability to look on a longer time horizon to be able to identify things that might happen and have a plan in place to deal with it. So what are some possible uses for scenario planning? Well, program service demand, maybe there's an increase or a decrease in demand for the programs that you have. And this is a great opportunity for you to think about some scenario planning and put some plans in place to kind of figure out what options are available to you. In today's day and times, funding stability is a high priority for a lot of organizations. So grant funding and other sources of funding might cause you to want to look at different types of scenarios and what if scenarios to figure out how to have a plan in place to deal with those. Communication strategies are another key component in the potential use for scenario planning. You have stakeholders out there who want to be updated on what's going on. Maybe you're thinking about a new program in the next few years, and you create scenarios to see what it would look like and what resources you need. And finally, capacity building could be another potential use for scenario planning because you have staffing needs. In many markets around the country today, it's really hard to find quality staff to support your programs. And that could be an issue where you need to identify what if scenarios and play around a little bit to see how you can make things work for you. So let's pivot a little bit here and let's talk about the steps in the scenario planning process. We've identified 5 that we wanted to talk with you here about today. We're going to cover them high level here, and then we'll dig into each one in a little bit more detail. So the first thing that we would suggest that you do in the scenario planning process is assess all the risks that are available to you. And we'll also talk about opportunities, and not everything has to be negative. We want to talk about positive stuff too. So assessing the key factors that are going to impact your organization. Now, when you do that, then we're going to ask you to look at and assign a priority to each one of them, because some of the risks or opportunities may have a high major impact to your operations, and others may have a medium impact, and some may have a smaller impact. They're going to impact you, but they're really not going to move the needle very much. And that's key in doing these scenario plans, keeping in mind that nothing is etched in stone, so you can be flexible and create multiple scenarios to identify the risks and opportunities. And that's the third piece of the puzzle here, is to create the scenarios. For many years, I was a coach in athletics. And when you're a coach, you create a game plan before you go into the game. And the reality is that game plan gives you a better chance to have a successful outcome. The same thing works here in the scenario planning process. By creating scenarios, you're in essence creating a game plan or various game plans that you can work towards to have a better outcome for your organization. And like with any game plan, once you create the scenarios, you don't just put it on a shelf and say, well, we did it. You want to assign actions. People have to have a role in carrying out the plan that you've put in place. So the step 4 is assigning actions by developing strategies and assigning responsibilities. And then anytime you create a plan and assign people to go do the work, you have to implement and you have to monitor. And again, it's not a set it and forget it kind of scenario. You adjust and refine as you go along, and that's how you do the scenario planning process. So let's dig into each one a little bit deeper and see how we can help you out here. So step one, assessing the risk. What are the key factors that likely are going to impact your organization? Again, we talk about risks here, but they could be opportunities as well, both positive and negative. And a good way to kind of get your brain thinking about what these risks might be is you're familiar with the three main functions within nonprofits. You have your program cost, your fundraising and development cost, and your administrative costs. So you want to kind of group them in those three areas because that will help you and assist you in developing your scenarios. And a good way to think about how to come up with these risk factors or these opportunities is something that we like to call the PESTLE approach, PESTLE. And these will help generate ideas for you to write down. So they are political, economical, social, technological, legal, and environmental. So you see on the screen here, there could be multiple ones, but we've identified just a few just for the purposes of our presentation here today. So on the program side, maybe rising program costs is a factor, or declining program attendance. On the fundraising side, maybe the funding freeze, is causing you to have to think about other ways to generate revenue. On the administrative side, maybe staff shortages is a risk factor. So these are all ideals for you to get your brain thinking about what kind of risk factors or opportunity factors you want to incorporate into your scenario plan. Now, one other thing I'll share with you, you have to think about these factors and these opportunities as whether they are short-term in nature or is this the new norm? Rising program costs, for example, is that something that's just short-term factor, or is that going to be the new norm? So there's lots of things to consider as you are developing your scenario plans, and it will help you along the way. So now that you identified these risks and these opportunities, the next thing we suggest is that you assign some kind of priority to them. Which one are mission critical to your organization? So some of them will have high priorities, and you really want to identify, the impacts, the revenue and expenditure impacts to your organization. Some might have a medium level impact. And again, as I mentioned earlier, some have a low impact where, they're going to affect your organization, but it's not going to move the needle very much. So by doing that, then you have the ability to kind of figure out what things are going to be important to your organization. So at this point, Carly, I think we're up for our next poll question.
You're absolutely right, Bill. So our next poll question has appeared in the slide area now. Which critical uncertainties are keeping you up at night? Is it reliance on a few major funders, staffing shortages, rising program costs, changes in service demand, shifts in public policy, competition from similar nonprofits, or even, Bill, I feel that there should be an option G, all of the above.
Yeah, right. All of the above. Well, I certainly hope that not everybody is losing sleep because of everything that's on the list, but we'll talk more later on in our presentation about revenue diversification. But one of the things as folks are filling out this poll question is, particularly when it relates to item F on the options, is we're actually seeing a trend that nonprofits are actually starting to collaborate because they're maybe working with the same mission and the same market, and they're combining resources because they can do more together than they could individually. So we'll talk more about that later on in the presentation.
I love that. I'm going to go ahead and advance. And it looks like we have a lot of people who are experiencing reliance on a few major funders and shifts in public policy, which I also saw in our Q&A, just speaking to the uncertainty in the time currently for those federal grantees. So, Bill, I know you've covered it a little bit so far, and I know you'll continue to kind of provide some tips and strategies, but I'll go ahead and pass it to you and to continue on.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. The funding uncertainty has a lot of people concerned, obviously. But the reality is things have come up. I shared this with somebody recently, is in the last 20 or so years, we've dealt with the housing crisis, economic upturns, downturns, pandemic, now this funding thing. So the reality is these things come and these things go. And as they say, this too shall pass. The reality is having scenario plans in place and having a game plan in place, while it won't cover everything, hopefully you'll be better in line to prepare for the next thing that comes down the road because you've got a game plan in place. And that's really where we're going to focus our next part of our presentation is now we've identified those risks and assigned a priority to them. Now we're going to start creating the scenarios. So what are the basics in creating the scenarios? Well, let's say you're going to be doing a 3 or a 5 year scenario plan. You want to have your projected revenues and expenses for that particular time period. Now you can use your historical data and the current year budget or forecast as a foundation. But as you're identifying the risks, you can also see there's maybe opportunities for new funding or different things that you may be able to do on the expense side. So having those projected revenues and expenses is going to be important. The other thing you want to do is get input from relevant stakeholders. When I was working in the public school system, for example, it wasn't me just going and creating a spreadsheet and saying, here's our projection, here's our scenario plan. The reality is I had to go talk to each of the school principals because they had their own budgets. So in your example, you talk to your program directors. I had to talk to the facilities manager because I needed to know if there was going to be a building with a new roof or a new HVAC unit, for example, that I needed to be aware of. So you're going to have to talk to different people and bring them in to get their ideas of what their needs are, especially if you're thinking about adding programs or cutting programs in the future. And you also have to talk to external stakeholders because there might be grantors involved or other folks involved in the process that you need to get input on. So again, you can use your budget or a current year forecast as a baseline, but that's kind of where your starting point is. And then what you'll need to do is establish assumptions for each scenario. Now you can have a multitude of scenarios, but for the purposes of our presentation today, we're going to highlight 3 scenarios. We're going to ask you to create an optimistic scenario, a reasonable scenario, and a catastrophic scenario. And the reality is you're setting up game plans to plan for these particular circumstances if they happen, using what you've identified in the previous step and assessing those risk factors and the priority level you've given them, and considering how each group of assumptions are going to impact the line items in your forecast. So what does that look like? So we're going to have an optimistic scenario. I like to call this our happy, happy, joy, joy scenario. What that means is everything we think that could happen is going to happen. So we're going to get new foundation grants. We're going to get a new federal award. We're going to do a donor appeal, and everyone's going to say, this is great. We love what you're doing. Here's my credit card. Here's the checkbook. And based on all that stuff, we're going to be able to add staff and add costs, and everything's going to go great. So you want to have a plan for that. You also want to have a reasonable scenario. And the caveat here is when you start thinking about reasonable scenarios, this is the one that'll probably have the biggest multitude of options for you. But for, again, today's purposes, we're going to consider one scenario. And what we're going to do here is not everything that we thought in scenario A is going to come to pass, but it's not really going to make too much of an impact. And so the expense side of things, we don't have to cut staff. We don't need to reduce expenses or anything like that. That's a different scenario. And then the third is your catastrophic scenario. This is the exact opposite of scenario A, where not only did not everything go the way we wanted to, it's going in the other direction. We're losing grants. We didn't get the contract and we lost government contracts. We did a donor appeal and nobody responded. And so based on that, we're going to have to cut costs, reduce staff. Nobody wants to be in scenario C. But the idea here is if you've created a scenario and you've created a game plan, as you're heading towards that, you can pivot and make changes. Again, you don't want to find out you're automatically in this situation and now you're reacting. You want to be proactive. And that's what scenario planning allows you the ability to do. So here are some strategies as it relates to addressing those things. And there's really 4 common ones for addressing these critical uncertainties. And these are not anything that you probably don't already know. Number 1, you can spend less money. You might decide you want to cut programs or cut staff. And a caveat here is to be careful, because if your plan is to save money by cutting programs or cutting staff, the possibility is the funding that comes with the program that you're cutting might go away as well, and you'll be back right in the same position you were at. But it is an option to, one way to deal with the strategy is to spend less money. Another one would be to spend the money differently. So maybe instead of investing in pursuing a new program, you channel that money into marketing or fundraising to be able to find additional sources to raise more money and get more money. And we'll talk again more about revenue diversification here at the end of our presentation. Third one would be to raise money differently. And that's kind of what I was just alluding to. So if you're a focus on grant funding, for example, have you explore the opportunity of going out to donors and things like that? I recently talked to an organization, and they were very heavily funded through government funding. And I shared that what we've seen is during this time where government funding is paused or being reduced, there are foundations and other philanthropic organizations that are increasing their funding to kind of make up that difference. And have they ever considered that? And by the look on their face, I don't know that they ever had thought about that. So you can raise money differently, and we'll talk more about that here in the second half of our presentation. And then the fourth one, which we probably all have heard, and the directive, especially if you're in the development department, go raise more money. Again, if it were that simple and we were able to just do it, then we wouldn't have to worry about anything else. But the reality is that is an opportunity for you to deal with uncertainties. So when you're talking about the scenario planning process and you're creating these scenarios, you've got to ask yourself the question, how is it going to affect the line items in our financials? So for example, on the contributed revenue side, and there's a loss of funding, how is that going to affect, is it your federal awards, your sponsorships, your donations? How is that going to affect particular line items there? On the earned revenue side, if there are challenges in program demand, how is that going to affect your fees, program fees? How is it going to affect your membership revenues? Or if you're an independent school, how's it going to affect your tuition revenue? So as you're creating these scenarios and you identify these risks, you're going to identify which line items are going to be impacted based on potential things that are happening. Now, many organizations have reserves, and this is a great opportunity to say, what funds do you have available from your reserves? And a caveat here is, it is okay for a nonprofit to have reserves. The reality is that's one of the strategies to protect yourself against short-term downfalls, is having at least 3 to 6 months of reserves put in place. Keeping in mind that being a nonprofit is a tax status, not a business model. And so what you really want to do is budget for surpluses, have reserves built up, and then what are the plans to rebuild the reserves if you need to tap into them? Similarly, what you want to think about is, do you have a line of credit? Now, lines of credit are not long-term strategies, but they're there in case you need them. You can tap them for short-term needs. And the reality is you have to have a plan for repayment of that line of credit. So these on the revenue side, you really want to factor all these things into the equation. Now, on the expenditure side, you want to do the same things as you're building your scenarios. Program cost. If you're thinking that you're going to cut a program, what expenses are going to be reduced? What expenses might need to increase? You may have, in order to, cut a program, for example, there might be legal costs involved. There might be termination if you have a lease, for example, on a building and you're cutting a program. There's lots of different things you've got to consider as you're going through this. On the admin side, you want to look at, if you're going to cut an entire program, how are your indirect costs going to be reallocated? Because the reality is that those costs still are being absorbed and they need to be spread against the remaining programs. Have debt service costs been considered? Unfortunately, the debt service costs don't go away and they're still going to be there. So how are you going to deal with that as you go through your scenario process? Now, program costs and admin costs, there are opportunities there to look at outsourced and fractional alternatives, because that gives you the ability to still get the service, but maybe without the expense of the staffing. And if staffing is a concern, there's an alternative there as well. Negotiation. Can you negotiate some of your expenses? And you might say, Bill, how do you negotiate expenses? Well, the reality is, an example would be our friends in the Los Angeles area at the beginning of this year. If you remember, they had some pretty significant wildfires. And so there were organizations there that reached out to their vendors and negotiated payments and kind of structured things out, because they were in serious crisis mode. And part of their plan was to negotiate some of those costs. And again, here we have the same thing that we talked about earlier. Can you reduce costs by forming partnerships, sharing resources? That's another way of approaching the cost aspect to some of the scenario plans. And also in-kind donations. There are a lot of opportunities where you get services donated, and except for going out and paying for them, maybe there are legal services or rent that somebody can donate to you. So there are options there for you to supplement some of the costs that you may otherwise pay for with an in-kind donation. So a lot of information there. Let's look at the nuts and bolts of how it would look financially. So here's a scenario. This is using an Excel spreadsheet. And what I will tell you, that there are many different programs that are out there that can do this kind of work. Obviously, we don't have time today in our presentation to go through all the different options that are out there. What I would suggest to you is to talk to your financial provider, whether you're doing it yourself or you're utilizing YPTC or another organization. They can get into the specifics of procedurally how to do this. But this is an Excel spreadsheet that shows a scenario plan with 3 different scenario options. So what you see here in the first column is you have an approved budget, and that shows a change in net assets of positive $250,000. Again, you can budget for surpluses and have reserves built up. So in our optimistic scenario, we say, we're going to create another $700,000 in revenue by getting new grants, new federal awards, the donor appeal, all those things that we talked about earlier, the risk factors and the priorities assigned to them. And because of that, we're going to add about $500,000 in new cost, and still we're going to increase our change in net assets by $185,000. Again, happy, joy. This is a great plan. Let's execute that and everyone will be okay. The reality is, it doesn't usually happen that way. So we create a reasonable scenario plan where not only do we not increase our revenues by $700,000, we decrease it by $150,000 because of things that are going on, and it gives us another alternative to work towards. But based on that, we don't really have to change anything with our expense side of things. We don't have to lay staff or cut expenses or anything like that. And the change in net assets does decrease, but we're still okay. Now, keep in mind, if you're doing a long range scenario and that seems to be the trend, the new norm, then you may have to pivot and do some of the other things that we talked about earlier to make sure that you don't continue it on a trend where you're losing every year. And then the third scenario is our catastrophic scenario. This is where not only did we not get the gains, but we lost $1 million in funding. And the reality is we had to cut programs, we had to cut staff, and our change in net assets is negative $205,000, so almost a $500,000 difference. Again, you never want to just show up one day at this catastrophic scenario, but you want to have a game plan in place, because if you're heading towards that, then you can pivot and take action. So the other thing, and I'll just touch on it really briefly, is our experience has shown that not everybody can look at a financial statement or a spreadsheet and understand what it means. And so there are alternative ways to show the same information. What we're showing here is a chart that basically has that same information. You see scenario 1, scenario 2, and scenario 3. You see the budget, but I don't have to be an expert in financial statements or graph reading to know that red line is not good, and it puts me in negative. And sometime in July, I'm going to need to tap a line of credit maybe, or build on reserves. So this is a tool that we utilize at YPTC. Again, talk with your provider, and maybe there are tools out there, but they're all alternatives to you to be able to create these scenarios and share the information with the end users. Okay, so now we've created the plan, and now it's time to assign some actions. And a plan is no good if you don't have people to carry out the plan. So what we're going to do is we recommend creating a cash forecast for each scenario, because we've all heard the term cash is king, right? So one thing I'll share with you is that the board on these scenario plans, they do not need to approve the scenario plan. It's not a board vote, but they do need to review them. They do need to be staying on top of what is happening and evaluating the progress and helping pivot if need be. So, and you do that by reviewing the cash forecast. You also do that by reviewing the month-end reports that you should be getting, looking at budgets versus actual. And we're going to show you here an example here in a second. But you also want to set deadlines when specific actions need to be completed. If you're going to assign somebody a task, there should be a set deadline for that to be done. Define those responsibilities. And we're going to share more about that here in a second. Assign who's going to be responsible for it, and identify the performance indicators, the KPIs that you're going to utilize to monitor the results. So again, it's no good to just set up a plan and just put it on the shelf. You have to assign people responsibilities to take care of things, and they have to be specific. So let's talk about the cash forecast. So here's an example of a cash forecast, and this is done on an accrual basis. I know some of you may do things on a cash basis, but this is done on an accrual basis. So you see on the bottom the adjustments to get it back to a cash basis. You've got your actual year-to-date results, and in our example, this is actual results from January through May of this particular fiscal year. And you see the forecast for the remainder of the year, June through December. So you can see in the actual year-to-date, we received government grants to the tune of $483,000. But if you look lower in that column, you'll see a negative $400,000. Backing that out, that just means we were awarded those funds, but we didn't receive the cash. So if you look on here, you can see that there's a particular month where cash all of a sudden is causing a problem. And hopefully you can see that's in July. So what that's telling us by reviewing the cash forecast is that this is not acceptable, and we've got to pivot. We've got to come up with a plan to address this. The reality, the problem we have here is that $400,000 that we're not getting right away, we're not expected to get that until November. So now we've got a few things that we've got to think about. Number one, what this does not show is, do you have a line of credit, or is this a good time to go out and get a line of credit to help meet those short-term needs? Do you have reserves already built in that will take care of the shortfall for that particular amount of time? But irrespective of that, if you don't have those, now we got to look at a couple of things. Could we try to get the government funding, the cash in sooner? Chances are that's going to be tough, but that's always an option. Or can we look at our expenditures and can we potentially defer that a little bit and defer some of those expenses to try to even out the cash position there? So again, these are some of the things that you start to think about as you create your scenario plans and you create a cash forecast, so you're able to put a plan in place and not be reactive. You don't want to be reactive, you want to be proactive. So as far as the specifics, you're defining some responsibilities and trying to make sure that they're clear, and there's what we would call, you're probably familiar with goal setting, and you've heard of SMART goals, right? They're specific, they're measurable, they're achievable, they're realistic, and they're timely. Well, the same thing applies here. As you're creating these responsibilities, you want to make sure they're smart. So here's an example. You could sit there and say to the grant writing consultant, we need to raise more funds, so go out and apply for more grants. And 2 months later, they come back and say, did what you said, I applied for a few grants and I got one. And everyone's great. How much was it for? Well, it was for $5,000, but we got one. That doesn't meet the needs of the plan that you've created. So here we're saying, we want you to go and apply for 3 new grants in the next 3 to 6 months, and we want you to secure at least $100,000 in new funding. Or the executive director, in the next 6 months, we want you to go and secure 2 new sponsorships with more $25,000 or more each. That will help you achieve your plan. You're assigning responsibilities, they're specific, they're targeted, and that's going to help you be more successful in trying to reach that optimistic scenario. So that is kind of where we're at in terms of the responsibility side of things. And I think, Carly, that brings us to our next poll question.
It does. So our next poll question, and this is our third poll question of 4 of our session today, and we're curious, what is the biggest challenge your organization faces when creating scenario plans? Is it lack of resources or expertise, uncertainty in external environment, difficulty in aligning with mission, resistance to change, or maybe other? And if it is something not on that list, go ahead and drop it in the Q&A, because we really are curious to know what sort of challenges you're facing. And we've already had a lot of really great comments and questions in the chat related to this topic, especially around, Bill, all of this to some people in our audience seems very time consuming. It's like the setup required. So what might you recommend to someone who might feel a little bit challenged when it comes to creating scenario plans and doesn't know where to start?
Sure. I mean, I think the reality is, there's a couple things. Number one, don't try to bite off more than you can chew. You've heard that saying before. So identify the key factors that are going to have a major impact. So if all you do is take those high priority items and say, okay, well, I'm expecting government grants to be X, and if we don't get them, what do we need to do? What other sources of revenue can we generate to make that up? And you have to be careful, because we talk about gap funding. If we can just go to a donor and say, we have a shortfall, can you fund it? That would be great. The reality is, that could be a challenge. There could be donor fatigue. People are asking, the same foundations for money. But I think to start out, just do it at a high level. Kind of look at the major things that are going to have an impact and kind of come up with a game plan. But utilize the resources that you have. Utilize your financial professionals internally. If you're an ED, for example, utilize YPTC, utilize your third-party providers that are out there. Again, utilize some of the software programs that are out there that make it fairly easy. There are programs out there where you can just play around with the different scenarios, the options, and it'll spit out a scenario plan. So you just have to take that first step, and
Mhm.
nothing is etched in stone. You can play around with it, whatever you need to be, but at least you'll start to see a vision once you get started.
One step at a time. And yes, just from the results, definitely to speaking to that is lack of resources, bandwidth, challenges, and I even one person said though the old adage of designing a new airplane while you're flying the old one, right? Um, so,
Yeah.
all right, Bill, back
Well,
to you.
and the reality is you do have to start somewhere, because again, you don't want to be reacting and find yourself in a situation where now it's too late to do things. So even if it's short term in nature, just kind of create a plan to say, okay, well, if I lose this funding, what are my options? Can I find other funding? Do I got to cut cost? At least start there, and then you can build upon that. So, all right, thanks, Carly. Well, the last step in the scenario planning process is you've done this work to identify your risk, assign them a priority, create some scenario plans, different scenarios. You've assigned some risk. You're putting a game plan into action. You're assigning responsibilities, and now you want to implement it. You're going to go out and play the game and try to do what you can to work towards the optimistic scenario and stay away from the catastrophic scenario. And then likely you're going to find yourself in some version of a realistic, reasonable scenario. Keep in mind, again, that boards do not need to approve these, but they do need to monitor them. And this whole process can be jeopardized if the board doesn't take action when you're heading towards that catastrophic scenario. You don't ever want to be there. You want to be constantly pivoting and updating. You see that forecast we just did, when we went through May. So when June happens, update the information with June's activity and kind of reassess your plan. That's a great way to do that. And that's something that we help our clients with every day. And that's something that is a resource that's out there. So now here's a weekly cash flow projection. Here's a way to kind of monitor things on a really micro basis. This is a weekly cash flow projection. So you have your beginning cash balance. You list all your inflows for that week. You list all your cash outflows for that week. And you may have to make adjustments for any restricted cash you need to keep on hand for restricted grants that you have. Your bank, if you have any kind of debt obligation, you may have a cash reserve requirement by the bank. So you want to factor that in. And in this example, you see that there's a line of credit that they have available to them. This is just another way, another tool. You don't have to do all these things, but this is another tool that will allow you to kind of monitor your cash position as you're working to achieve one of those scenarios that you created. I can tell you, when I was in the home building industry back in Las Vegas in the late 2000s, you bet I was doing this on a weekly basis. In fact, I think I was doing it on a daily basis, because that's how tight cash was. That was crisis mode for us. So that's just a kind of an example of the process of scenario planning. Now let's talk a little bit about revenue diversification. We know that nonprofits are resilient, and many of you are running very lean as it is. And when you come into crisis time, the first thing you think about is cutting cost. Well, the thought process here, there might be various other doors and opportunities that are open to you to diversify your revenue streams. And we've talked with a lot of our clients, and they've shared a lot of information that's really helped in this area. And so what we want to do is share some of this information with you. So there are a couple of different streams, and some of you may or may not be familiar with them. So let's talk a little bit about that. Contributed revenue, think of it like this. Somebody wants to give you money, but they're not expecting anything in return. So that's where your grants are, your donations, your gifts, in-kind donations, gifts of fixed assets. So I'm going to give you money. I'm not expecting anything in return for that gift I'm giving you. So some options when it comes to contributed revenue to think about alternatives, you can cultivate your donors. So there are funders out there that are providing grants. Now, if you're focused solely on foundations, maybe you've got some grants, but if you're maybe you do things differently. Maybe grants are an alternative that maybe you need to look into a little bit more. Research funders you haven't pursued before. You could do a search online and find a plethora of foundations out there that are looking to give nonprofits money. As we go through this section, I want to just kind of give you a caveat and a high level thing to think about. In all of these scenarios, individuals or organizations or foundations are not going to know to give you money if they don't know who you are, what your mission is, or that you exist. Okay, you're going to have to go out and reach out to these people, let them know who you are, and build those relationships. There might be organizations out there where if one of their employees makes a charitable contribution, they'll match it. So go find those organizations. And a lot of times it comes through somebody saying, listen, I want to give you money, and my organization matches that. Utilize that to help as a revenue stream for you. Donor relations. Donors love to be appreciated. So there might be a donor appreciation event. A lot of times you may have a gala or something like that. Utilize that to be able to connect with donors and see if there's additional funding that's out there. Set up automatically monthly payments, giving options. I think many of us are familiar with probably the most popular one that I can think of out there, and that's your local PBS station. You know, they have the telethons, and while we don't usually like to wait 20 minutes while we're watching some great material to have them talk about it, but they often do a great job saying, for your monthly contribution of X, you're going to get something. So set up the automatic monthly payments. The donor advised funds that are out there. There are lots of people who have created a donor advised fund, and you can utilize that as an income stream for you, a revenue stream for you. From a board perspective, one of the misconceptions that we've always seen with boards is that many times they don't realize one of their main responsibilities is to go raise money, to use their network that they're coming in with to help raise money for the nonprofit organization. So give them the tools and the education to do that. Same thing with your volunteers. You know, they have a network out there. You know, again, people are not going to know to give you money if they don't know you exist and what your mission is. And then in the estate planning side of things, there are charitable gift annuities, endowments. There's lots of different structure that's out there. Also, another one that's not on here is in-kind donations. Find some more in-kind donations. These are different strategies to help you seek funding from different sources than maybe you're doing currently. Now, earned revenue is a little bit different than contributed revenue. On the contributed revenue, we said, I'm going to give you money, but I don't expect anything in return. Well, earned revenue is just the opposite. I'm going to give you money, but I do expect something in return. I'm either going to buy something from you, give you money, you're going to give me merchandise. Or maybe you're a theater and I'm going to give you money and for a ticket, and you're going to do a performance or tuition. You see all the examples here on the screen. So this is a little bit different that maybe you're not aware of. So what are the strategies there? I will say before I go into this that anytime you create an option here, you might want to talk to your tax accountant or your attorneys about unrelated business income potential effects. In fact, a little plug here, I believe in 2 weeks on the 28th, we're going to be doing a webinar just like this on unrelated business income. So if you're interested in exploring that, please register for that. But as far as earned revenue goes, here are some services. Offer tiered membership benefits. Maybe you have a membership, and for that membership, the members get a certain amount of support or items. Well, create tiered memberships. So the higher the membership, the more services they get. Implement a pay what you can model so people can access generating revenue. On the sales side, charge for workshops or educational programs that are aligned to your mission. Utilize the experience and knowledge base you have about your mission to share that with other people and use that as a potential revenue source. Same thing here about selling branded merchandise or other related mission-related products. What better way to tell people about your organization than to have people walking around with a bag or a shirt or a hat that has your your name and your logo and your information on there. Again, people won't know to give you money if they don't know you exist. An example I can think of that works great is like a zoo. They do that, but there's plenty of other organizations that do that. Monetize webinars or live stream discussions or utilize other resources that are out there. Rent out space. If you have a facility and you can rent out space and generate some revenue, go ahead and do that. Co-produce events and sharing the cost. We've talked about that a few times today. And then if you have the ability to rent or sell some specialized items, go ahead and do it. Think creatively, think out of the box. How can you create some additional income? Now, on the general side of things, I'm an older guy. I mean, I know that social media is out there. The younger generation, they live with social media. So are you using social media tools and crowdfunding to let people know you exist? Again, exposure, get your name out there. Publish your financials to your website. It could be your audit report if you have that, your 990, or at a minimum, put your annual report in there and highlight what you're doing with the money that you've been given so you can show people that you're a good steward of the dollars that you've been given. Claim or update your free candidate profile on GuideStar. I think we just did a webinar on, charity-related or rating organizations. So go and check that out. But if you have a gold or a platinum rating on there and a donor sees that, the chances are of you getting additional funds actually increases. From the outreach side of things, a little advocacy here. Educate your local and state officials on the economic impact of your local, on your organization, on the local economy. Get involved with your chamber or your business league. Now, that you're not going to show up to one of those meetings and someone's going to say, oh, I was waiting for you to show up. Here's $1 million. But you're making those connections. Maybe somebody you meet knows somebody who has a foundation and is looking for a nonprofit. Or maybe you'll find a new board member. These are long-term strategies to try and build relationships. Or you can hire a consultant to source new opportunities. Again, key here, not every action is going to be profitable, but it builds steps to build your organization in the eyes of people, and that can help you raise money. Build those relationships over time, gather the feedback from people, and again, pivot. Keep doing things that will help you raise money differently than maybe you currently are at now. And I think, Carla, this brings us to our last poll question in the last few minutes we have left.
Yes, it does. All right, so with everything of that said, how confident are you in your organization's ability to remain financially sustainable in the next 5 years? Are you very confident? Are you not confident at all? Are you somewhere in the middle of that? And maybe after hearing today's webinar, your answer has slightly changed from the start. But Bill, just as the participants are responding to the poll, if you could kind of summarize or maybe like leave the audience with one key takeaway, what might that be?
Well, there's a lot of them. So if I had one, I would say, don't be afraid of this and get started. You don't have to do it alone. Reach out to your financial folks, reach out to YPTC, reach out to your consultant, say, okay, I need help. How do we start? This is too important of a thing to let just not be done. We should all be doing scenario planning, but especially if you're in a crisis mode right now, you don't want to let this pass and without a game plan.
Absolutely. And I'll just add as well, as I've heard from other experts within YPTC, know that it's okay to make it very clear to your funders, to your new stakeholders or your boards that just make very clear statements that underscore the impact that you have and the work that you're doing. So don't be shy to share those stories about the great work that you do and that your desire to do more, of course, but being transparent about the challenges that you're facing at these times. So, all right, I'll close the poll, and it seems like most people are right there in the middle,
Cool.
which makes a lot of sense.
Awesome. Well, hey, just as we wrap up here today, and I appreciate your time, taking time out of your busy schedule for this presentation. Some takeaways, obviously, besides getting started, If you don't have a line of credit, again, please go and consider that. Again, the best time to get a line of credit is when you don't need it, so you have it when you need it. Establish board designated reserves. It's okay, again, to build reserves for rainy days, for future programs. And I'll just remind you again, being a nonprofit, that's a tax status, not a business model. I know it says right in the name nonprofit, but the reality is we want you to build reserves and budget for a surplus. When you do your budgets, make sure you budget for a surplus if you can to help build those reserves. A lot of scenario planning will be a lot easier if you've got reserves and a line of credit in place, in addition to the strategies we talked about today. And overall, the key there is if there's no money, then there's no mission. You can't carry out your mission if you don't have the money to do it. So again, thank you so much for your time today. And Carly, if there's any last minute items you need to discuss, please do. But again, thank you all for joining us.
Nothing from me. Enjoy your rest of your week, everyone, and thanks again.